December 1944, the Ardennes forest. A German paratrooper named Werner Strecek, 19 years old, is lying face down in frozen Belgian mud. His ears are ringing. The tree he was using for cover has been cut in half by something he has never experienced before. Shells are exploding in the air above him. Not on the ground, not in the dirt, in the air. Shrapnel is raining down like hot needles into his foxhole, into his helmet, into the backs of men who thought they were safe behind cover. He will later tell his captors something that American intelligence officers will hear over and over again in the winter of 1944. We feared the American artillery more than anything, more than their tanks, more than their planes. There was no place to hide. Hold that thought. Now rewind 21 months. February 1943, the Tunisian desert. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel is watching American soldiers run. His Afrika Korps has just torn through their positions at Kasserine Pass like a hot knife through butter. Tanks abandoned in the sand. Artillery pieces captured before their crews could squeeze off a single round. Entire battalions scattered across 50 miles of chaotic retreat. Over 6,000 American casualties in less than a week. Rommel writes home to his wife with something close to satisfaction. The Americans, he notes, have not yet learned how to fight. 3,000 miles away, a German general named Günther Blumentritt will later sit across from British military historian Basil Liddell Hart and deliver a very different verdict. We regarded General Patton extremely highly, Blumentritt will say, as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. Rommel believed the Americans were amateurs. Blumentritt knew they had become something far more dangerous. The distance between those two judgments, between contempt and genuine fear, is one of the most remarkable military transformations in modern history. And it explains something that most people have never thought about. When German soldiers who fought against the British, the Canadians, and the Americans sat down after the war and described their enemies, they used fundamentally different words. The British, professional, methodical, predictable. The Canadians, ruthless and tenacious. But the Americans? The words they used carried a different weight entirely. Overwhelming, unpredictable, relentless, and above all, terrifying in their firepower. This is the story of how a military that Germany's finest generals literally laughed at became the fighting force they feared more than any other on the Western Front. And it starts with a humiliation so complete that it almost killed the American war effort before it began. To understand why German soldiers eventually feared American infantry, we need to go back to the moment they first stopped laughing. And that moment has a very specific address, a dusty mountain pass in Tunisia, February 1943. But before we get to that catastrophe, you need to understand just how bad things were before the shooting even started. Part 1. The Army That Nobody Feared. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world. Let that number sink in for a moment. 19th. Smaller than the Army of Portugal. Smaller than Romania. The entire American ground force consisted of roughly 190,000 men, about the same number of people who attend a single weekend of the Coachella Music Festival. While Germany had been building the most sophisticated military machine the world had ever seen, while the Wehrmacht had been perfecting the art of combined arms warfare across Poland, France, and North Africa, the United States Army was still training with wooden rifles and trucks labeled tank because they did not have enough actual tanks to go around. American factories produced automobiles and washing machines, not panzers and artillery pieces. The nation had not fought a major war in over 2 decades. Its soldiers, according to every German intelligence report, were soft. Its officers were inexperienced. Its population was divided by class, ethnicity, and fierce political disagreement over whether America should fight at all. Nazi ideology poured gasoline on this assessment. Adolf Hitler believed that national strength flowed from racial purity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent martial superiority that would show itself on every battlefield. America, a mongrel nation of immigrants from every corner of the globe. How could such a country possibly match the fighting spirit of the German soldier? Hitler told his inner circle that he did not see much future for the Americans. Their diverse society, he insisted, would crack under the terrible pressure of modern industrial war. The memory of the First World War seemed to back up these assumptions. American troops had arrived in France in 1917, fought adequately in the final campaigns, but entered late, suffered lighter casualties than the European powers, and contributed little to the strategic direction of the conflict. German officers who had faced those green doughboys in the Meuse-Argonne remembered them as enthusiastic but undisciplined, brave but tactically naive, willing to charge frontally into machine gun fire but unable to sustain complex operations. The idea that their sons would be fundamentally different seemed laughable to men who had spent their entire careers studying the art of war. Remember this German confidence. Remember how deep it went, how logical it seemed. Because what happened next at Kasserine Pass appeared to prove every single one of these assumptions completely correct. Now picture this. It is early 1943. American forces have landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. They have brushed aside Vichy French defenders with relative ease, and now they are about to face the Wehrmacht for the very first time. The man leading them into this fight is Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the American Second Corps. And here is where our story takes its first dark turn. Fredendall was, to put it diplomatically, one of the most spectacularly incompetent generals to hold high command during the entire Second World War. He had come highly recommended. General George C. Marshall himself had called him one of the best. But recommendation and reality are very different things, especially when bullets start flying. Imagine you are a soldier in Second Corps. Your commanding general has set up his headquarters 70 miles behind the front line. Not 7. 70. He has diverted an entire battalion of combat engineers, men who should be building defensive positions for your unit, to instead blast underground bunkers into the side of a rocky ravine for his personal command post. He is so obsessed with the possibility of an air attack on himself that he has ringed his bunker with anti-aircraft guns. His troops have started calling it Lloyd's very last resort. Others called it Shangri-La, a million miles from nowhere. Fredendall never visited the front lines. He issued orders over the radio in a personal code that nobody could decipher. He called infantry units walking boys and artillery pop guns. Instead of using standard military map coordinates, he made up cryptic references like the place that begins with C. His subordinates wasted precious hours trying to figure out what on earth he was talking about while the enemy was maneuvering against them. But his worst sin was tactical. He scattered his forces across a 30-mile front, leaving units isolated and unable to support each other. He positioned American troops in locations where they could not cover each other's flanks. He split up the 1st Armored Division against the explicit objections of its commander, Major General Orlando Ward. Everything that basic military doctrine said you should never do, Fredendall did with enthusiasm. When Brigadier General Omar Bradley, who would later command the largest American army in history, visited Fredendall's headquarters, he called it an embarrassment to every American soldier. When Eisenhower himself came to inspect, he was so disturbed that he reminded his senior commanders that even generals must assume personal risk in combat. Fredendall did not take the hint. Now think about what this means for the American soldiers at the front. They are facing the Afrika Korps, one of the most experienced fighting formations on the planet. Their commanding general is hiding in a bunker 70 miles away, issuing incomprehensible orders. Their units are spread out like targets at a shooting range. Many replacements have arrived only days before, some without even completing basic training. They have no idea what they are walking into, and Erwin Rommel is about to show them. On February 14th, 1943, Rommel struck. His panzers rolled through gaps in the American line that should never have existed. Valentine's Day, 1943. The Americans got a gift they would never forget. German 88mm guns, which had already earned a terrifying reputation in the desert, tore through American armor with surgical precision. The M4 Sherman tanks, caught in the open without infantry support, burned like matchboxes, Here is a detail that tells you everything about the level of inexperience. American units had laid minefields in front of their positions and then marked them with flags so their own troops would not walk into them. The Germans appreciated the thoughtfulness. They simply drove around the clearly marked obstacles. The retreat became a rout. Officers lost contact with their men. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation and were destroyed piece by piece. Prisoners by the thousands marched into German captivity, stunned by the speed and completeness of their defeat. In the confusion, Fredendall ordered a withdrawal that turned into a 50-mile retreat, the longest single American pullback of the entire war, bigger even than the fallback during the Battle of the Bulge a year and a half later. Let me give you one soldier's experience to make this real. Private First Class Robert Moore, a 20-year-old from Oklahoma serving with the 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Division, had been in North Africa for barely 2 months when the German attack hit. His regiment was positioned near Kasserine Pass, exactly where the main German thrust came through. When the panzers appeared out of the morning haze, Moore's company had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping them. They had been told the Germans were unlikely to attack in strength. Within hours, his battalion was surrounded. Within 2 days, most of the 168th Infantry Regiment had been killed or captured. Of the roughly 2,900 men in the regiment who went into the battle, fewer than 1,000 came out. Moore was among those captured. He would spend the rest of the war in a German prisoner camp. Here is another story from Kasserine that rarely gets told. Staff Sergeant Howard Garner, a mechanic with the 1st Armored Division, was captured on February 15th near Sidi Bouzid. His unit had been ordered to counterattack without proper reconnaissance, without knowing the strength of the German forces they were facing. His half-track was hit by an 88mm round before he ever saw the gun that fired it. 3 of his crew were killed instantly. Garner would spend the next 27 months in German prisoner camps, wondering every day why his leaders had put him in a position where defeat was inevitable. He was asking the right question. The answer was Fredendall. Here is something else most people do not know about Kasserine. After the disaster, Fredendall was not just relieved of command. He was promoted to lieutenant general and sent back to the United States to command the Second Army in a training role. Promoted after presiding over the worst American defeat of the war. Meanwhile, Major General Orlando Ward, the 1st Armored Division commander, who had correctly objected to Fredendall's order to split his tanks, was relieved by Patton shortly after for perceived caution, despite having fought under impossible conditions created by his superior. The man who made the right call was punished. The man who made every wrong call was rewarded. The army would eventually learn from this injustice too. The final toll at Kasserine was devastating. Over 6,000 American casualties, including approximately 3,000 captured. The Americans also lost 183 tanks, destroyed or abandoned in the desert sand, along with hundreds of other vehicles, artillery pieces, and massive quantities of supplies. Omar Bradley would later call it probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. And here is the thing that made Kasserine so dangerous, not for the Americans, but for the Germans. Rommel and his fellow commanders drew exactly the conclusions you would expect. The Americans lacked the hardness required for sustained combat. Their material abundance could not compensate for their tactical incompetence. Their diverse population produced soldiers without the cohesion that came from shared national identity. Rommel wrote that the Americans would require months, perhaps years, to develop into serious opponents. Other German generals were less generous. They expected future encounters to produce similar results with similar ease. They were making the biggest miscalculation of the war, because in the ashes of Kasserine, something was already happening, something that Rommel, smart as he was, could not see yet. The Americans were not behaving the way defeated armies usually behave. They were not demoralized and passive. They were not waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They were reorganizing with a speed that seemed almost unnatural, as if the defeat had awakened something rather than broken it. But to understand what the Americans built from the wreckage of Kasserine, the machine that would eventually make German soldiers genuinely afraid, we first need to meet the man who lit the fuse. A general so profane, so theatrical, so absolutely uncompromising that German intelligence would eventually describe him as the one Allied commander who truly fought the way they fought. His name was George S. Patton, and he was about to turn a defeated army into a weapon. Part 2. The Learning Machine. There is a moment, right after Kasserine, that tells you everything you need to know about how the American military actually works. It is the moment that should have terrified German intelligence, and would have if they had been paying attention. Within weeks of the worst American defeat of the war, Eisenhower did something that no German commander would have done. He fired Fredendall, just like that. The man George Marshall had personally recommended, the two-star general commanding a corps in active combat, gone. No politics, no committees, no protection of ego or rank. Just a cold calculation. This man failed. Replace him with someone who will not fail. Imagine that happening in the German army. Imagine a field marshal firing one of Hitler's favorites after a single battle. It would never happen. German commanders who failed were sometimes quietly transferred, sometimes punished, but the rigid hierarchy and political entanglements of the Nazi system made rapid leadership changes nearly impossible. The Americans had just demonstrated something far more dangerous than any weapon: institutional honesty about failure. On March 6, 1943, George Patton arrived to take command of 2nd Corps, and what happened next was, by any measure, one of the fastest military transformations in modern history. Patton descended on the demoralized formation like a tornado. He demanded discipline with an intensity that bordered on mania. Soldiers who had slouched through Kasserine in dirty uniforms found themselves standing at attention, polishing brass, wearing helmets and neckties at all times. Patton personally fined officers who appeared without proper uniform. He threatened to court-martial anyone who showed cowardice under fire. One officer who was there when Patton took over remembered his first encounter decades later. General Patton said, "Every man old enough will shave every day. Officers will wear ties in combat." Then he came up to about a foot in front of my face and said, "And anyone wearing a wool knit cap without a steel helmet will be shot." Was it absurd? Maybe. But here is what Patton understood that Rommel was only beginning to suspect. The Americans who broke at Kasserine were not soldiers yet. They were civilians in uniform. And the fastest way to make civilians into soldiers is to create an environment where sloppiness is unacceptable, where standards are non-negotiable, where the expectation of excellence becomes a physical presence you can feel pressing against you every hour of every day. Bradley, who was now Patton's deputy, observed the change with professional admiration. Each time a soldier knotted his tie, buckled his chin strap, and brushed his boots, he was reminded that Patton had come to change things. It was psychology disguised as dress code. But Patton did not just demand sharp creases. He trained his men relentlessly. He ran exercises day and night. He pushed units through scenarios designed to simulate the chaos of armored warfare. And he did something else that would prove devastating to German plans. He led from the front. Where Fredendall had hidden in his bunker 70 miles behind the line, Patton was in his jeep, wearing his famous ivory-handled pistols, driving toward the sound of guns. The contrast could not have been more stark. The transformation revealed itself with shocking clarity barely 4 weeks after Kasserine. Remember this date, March 23rd, 1943. The Battle of El Guetar. Patton positioned his forces across the approaches to this vital pass with a care that had been utterly absent in February. He prepared defensive positions. He coordinated his artillery. He set his mines intelligently. And then he waited. When 50 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolled forward through the morning mist that day, their crews expected to scatter the Americans as easily as they had at Kasserine. They advanced with the casual confidence of men who had beaten this enemy before. Why would it be any different this time? They were catastrophically wrong. American mines disabled the lead panzers, blocking the narrow approach and funneling the following vehicles into killing zones. Tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions with accuracy that genuinely surprised the German crews. Infantry held their ground with discipline that had been completely absent just 4 weeks earlier. And then the artillery began. What the Germans encountered at El Guitar was something entirely new, not just more guns. The Americans certainly had more guns now. Something systematic, something coordinated in ways that German artillery had never achieved. The bombardment that fell on the 10th Panzer Division that morning was not the scattered fire of individual batteries working on their own. It was a concentrated storm of steel that seemed to come from everywhere at once, adjusted with a speed and accuracy that German artillerists found difficult to believe. The German attack shattered. Roughly 30 tanks were left burning or disabled on the approaches to the pass. Their infantry, caught in the open, were pinned and slaughtered by massed artillery fire that followed them as they tried to withdraw. When captured, German soldiers wept openly. Some told their American interrogators that this was the first time in the entire war they had been stopped by artillery and infantry alone, without significant opposing armor. Major General Terry Allen, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had vowed that he would never pull back and would shoot the first man who tried. He did not have to carry out the threat. His soldiers stood and fought like men who had something to prove. Why am I telling you about El Guitar in such detail? Because it reveals the weapon that German soldiers would come to fear more than any tank, any plane, any flamethrower on the entire Western Front, the American artillery system. And to understand why it was so devastating, you need to understand something that was happening at a quiet military post in Oklahoma while the rest of the world was tearing itself apart. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Between the wars, when most nations were slashing their military budgets and paying little attention to artillery innovation, a small group of American officers was quietly revolutionizing the way artillery could be used in combat. They developed something called the Fire Direction Center, and it was, without exaggeration, the most important tactical innovation of the entire war that did not involve splitting an atom. Here is the difference. In the German and British systems, a forward observer controlled his own batteries through direct communication. Each battery operated somewhat independently. If you wanted to mass the fire of multiple batteries on a single target, it took time. Coordination had to move up the chain of command and back down again. German systems required 10 to 12 minutes from the moment a target was identified to the moment shells started landing on it. The American system centralized fire control at the battalion level and created standardized procedures that slashed that time to approximately 3 minutes. Any observer anywhere on the battlefield could call for fire from any battery in range without needing a prior relationship with that battery. Fire requests could be passed upward from battalion to division to corps level with remarkable speed. If the situation demanded it, the entire artillery of an army corps could be focused on a single target. Think about what that means on the ground. A single American observation aircraft, a fragile Piper Cub with fabric wings, no weapons, a top speed barely faster than a car, could call down the fire of dozens of guns on any target visible from the air. German soldiers learned to dread those tiny planes circling overhead. They knew exactly what followed. Within minutes, shells would begin falling with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural, and the Americans perfected a technique that multiplied the horror beyond anything the Germans had experienced. It was called time on target. Batteries of different calibers, positioned at varying distances from the target, would calculate their firing times so precisely that all shells from all guns would arrive simultaneously. No warning shot, no first shell to send men diving for cover, just sudden, overwhelming destruction appearing from nowhere as if the sky itself had collapsed. Remember that detail about the Fire Direction Center. It is going to become absolutely critical later, at a frozen ridge in Belgium, where it will save the entire Allied war effort. But we are not there yet. By May of 1943, the war in North Africa was over, and the scale of the Allied victory stunned even the victors. Approximately 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, roughly 3 times more prisoners than the Soviets had taken at Stalingrad. The Americans who had panicked under Rommel's first blow were now among the victors, processing captured equipment and accepting German surrenders. German intelligence officers back in Berlin struggled to explain what had happened. The Americans had been routed in February. By May, they were conducting offensive operations with skill and aggression that matched veteran formations with years of combat experience. The speed of improvement defied every model German planners possessed for estimating enemy capabilities. Rommel himself understood better than most what he had witnessed. In a passage from his papers published after the war, he wrote with unusual candor, "The Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends." Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, although we had to wait until the Patton Army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. The man who had dismissed American soldiers as hopeless amateurs in February was predicting their future mastery by spring. Hold on to that, because what happened next, in the hedgerows of Normandy, would test every lesson the Americans had learned and force them to invent entirely new ones under fire. When American forces came ashore on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they faced a tactical nightmare that no amount of training had prepared them for. The bocage country, the hedgerow terrain inland from the beaches, was a killing field unlike anything the Allies had anticipated. Picture this: ancient earthen banks, some as high as 15 feet, topped with dense vegetation that had been growing for centuries. Every small field surrounded by these natural walls, turning each patch of farmland into a fortress. The fields were tiny, often no more than 100 yards across, and every single one of them was a potential ambush site. Tanks could not push through the hedgerows without climbing over them, and when a Sherman tank climbed a hedgerow, it tilted backward, exposing its thin belly armor to German anti-tank guns positioned on the other side. The tanks could not use their own guns because they were pointing at the sky. Infantry advancing without armor support was slaughtered by German machine guns, positioned with interlocking fields of fire across each field. The bocage was a problem that existing American doctrine simply had not addressed, because nobody had imagined fighting in terrain quite like this, the offensive ground to a halt. Gains were measured in yards, not miles. Casualties mounted at a sickening rate. For every hedgerow taken, men died, and there were thousands of hedgerows. German commanders who watched the American struggles in June and early July briefly allowed themselves a flicker of hope. Perhaps Kasserine would repeat itself. Perhaps the Americans would prove unable to solve a problem that required improvisation rather than simple firepower. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, built his entire defensive strategy on this assumption: screen off the predictable British around Caen, while concentrating mobile reserves against the Americans in the bocage, where the terrain so strongly favored the defense. And then the Americans did something that would never, ever have happened in the German army. Something that captures the essence of why they would ultimately be feared more than any other enemy the Wehrmacht faced. A sergeant had an idea. His name was Curtis Cullen. He was 29 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Armored Division. And the idea did not even start with him. According to military historian Max Hastings, it started with a Tennessee soldier named Roberts, who said in a group discussion, "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Everyone laughed. Everyone except Cullen. He took scrap steel from the German beach obstacles still littering the Normandy coast, the very obstacles Rommel had ordered placed to stop the invasion, and welded them into 4 prongs on the front of a Sherman tank. Tusks, like a rhinoceros. When the tank hit a hedgerow, instead of climbing over it and exposing its belly, it bored straight through at ground level, bursting out the other side with a shower of earth and tangled roots. General Omar Bradley came to see a demonstration. He watched in awe as a hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman bursting through. Bradley immediately ordered mass production. Within 3 weeks, ordnance units working around the clock had equipped 3 out of every 5 tanks in First Army with the Cullen hedgerow cutter. The device was kept strictly secret from German intelligence. Think about what just happened. A sergeant, not a general, not an engineer with a doctorate, a sergeant solved a problem that had baffled an entire army for 5 weeks, and the system did not punish him for stepping out of line or ignore his idea because of his rank. It recognized the innovation, amplified it, and deployed it at scale in days. Eisenhower himself would later tell the story of Sergeant Kulin in a speech, saying, "The biggest and happiest group in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew this thing worked." In the German military, innovation flowed downward from the officer corps. In the American military, it could flow from anywhere. This cultural difference, this willingness to listen to a sergeant from New Jersey when a general from West Point could not solve the problem, was one of the most significant reasons German commanders would ultimately describe Americans with a different kind of fear. Kulin, by the way, lost a leg 4 months later in the Hürtgen forest. He went home, married a woman named Bernice Enright in 1945, worked for Schenley Industries in New York, and died quietly in Greenwich Village in 1963 at age 48. He never sought fame. Eisenhower remembered him. History should, too. But the Rhino tanks were just the appetizer. Because on July 25, 1944, the Americans unleashed something on the German army that survivors would still be trying to describe in their memoirs decades later. Operation Cobra. Approximately 3,000 American aircraft, over 1,500 heavy bombers, supported by medium bombers and fighter bombers, dropped their loads in a carefully planned carpet bombing pattern on a rectangle roughly 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep. The target area straddled the Saint-Lô to Perrier Road. Sitting directly in the center of the impact zone was the Panzer-Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the entire German military. Panzer-Lehr was not some second-rate unit scraped together from conscripts. It was the Wehrmacht's showcase division, originally formed from training and demonstration troops, the best instructors and the best students. Every one of its Panzer Grenadier battalions rode in armored half-tracks, a luxury no other German division possessed. It was commanded by Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, who had served as Rommel's chief of staff. By the time Cobra launched, Panzer-Lehr had already been ground down by weeks of fighting. It had roughly 2,200 combat troops remaining, and about 45 armored vehicles still operational, a shadow of its original strength. But its soldiers were experienced professionals who knew their business. What happened on July 25th defied their comprehension. Bayerlein would later write 20 separate manuscripts as a prisoner of war, attempting to describe what Cobra did to his division. He wrote that the bombers came as if on a conveyor belt. Back and forth the carpet was laid, artillery positions wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened. By midday, the entire area resembled what he called a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. Over 70% of my soldiers, Bayerlein reported, were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. Let that sentence sink in. Not 10%, not a quarter. Over 70% of an elite German division was rendered combat ineffective in a matter of hours. Some of his men went mad from the concussion and ran screaming into the open until they were cut down. The division that had entered the day with 45 armored vehicles ended it with, by various accounts, only 7 tanks still capable of movement. When the dazed survivors emerged from their shattered positions to face the American ground assault, they found Sherman tanks with Cullen's hedgerow cutters smashing through obstacles that had blocked the advance for weeks. Remember those tusks that a sergeant invented from scrap metal? This is where they earned their place in history. The bocage, which had been the German defender's best friend for 6 weeks, was no longer an obstacle. The battlefield had changed overnight. But Cobra came with a terrible cost that must be mentioned. The bombing was not perfect. Some aircraft dropped short, hitting American positions. On the first day of bombing, July 24th, friendly fire killed 25 Americans and wounded 131. On the main bombing day, July 25th, it happened again. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. He had been at the front as an observer. The Americans buried their own dead from their own bombs, grieved, and attacked anyway. That, too, tells you something about what they had become since Kasserine. The breakthrough at Cobra opened the gates for exactly the kind of sweeping, mobile warfare that German generals had believed only they could execute, and what poured through those gates was about to change their minds forever. But I want you to understand what Cobra looked like from the German side, because it explains the psychology of fear. Hauptmann Klaus Stresemann, a company commander in the 352nd Infantry Division, positioned near the Cobra target zone, would later describe the bombardment as something that exceeded human experience. His men, veterans of Normandy since D-Day, had endured weeks of heavy combat. They had been shelled before, they had been strafed before, but nothing had prepared them for what it felt like to have 1,500 heavy bombers pass overhead in formation and systematically erase the landscape around them. The vibration alone, he said, made your teeth rattle. Men who were not directly hit by bombs were knocked unconscious by the concussion waves. Those who survived the first pass thought it was over. Then the second wave arrived, and the third. By the time the ground assault began, Stresemann's company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. He surrendered with 7 men, all that remained of over 120. Patton's Third Army, unleashed at last, swept across France in an offensive that covered more ground in less time than any comparable operation in the entire history of warfare up to that point. German commanders watched in disbelief as American armored columns appeared behind their defensive positions, cutting communications, overrunning supply depots, trapping entire formations before they could organize orderly retreats. The encirclement at the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 destroyed the German 7th Army as an effective fighting force. By various estimates, somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a shrinking perimeter under continuous attack. Around 10,000 died in the pocket. Approximately 50,000 surrendered. General Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 2nd Panzer Division surveyed the aftermath and described the scene as approaching horror. Mountains of destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and dead soldiers scattered across the roads, increasing by the hour. Eisenhower walked the battlefield 2 days after the pocket closed and wrote that what he saw could only be described by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The German commanders who had dismissed American fighting quality at Kasserine now struggled to explain what had happened. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's foremost theorist of armored warfare, was asked after the war about Patton. His response was professional praise of the highest order. I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place. Coming from the man who literally invented blitzkrieg, that was not a polite compliment. That was a professional soldier acknowledging he had met his equal. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at German Supreme Headquarters, was more blunt. The war was already lost in the West, he confessed during captivity. At the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the war of movement in France, that transformation, from Kasserine to Cobra, from laughingstock to nightmare, happened in less than 18 months. And yet, as devastating as Normandy was for the Wehrmacht, the Americans had not yet deployed their most terrifying weapon, a weapon that cost over $1 billion to develop, a miniature technological miracle small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, a weapon so secret that American troops were forbidden from using it near the front lines for fear that the Germans would capture an unexploded example and reverse engineer it. It was called the proximity fuse, and when it finally appeared on the battlefields of Europe in December 1944, it would turn German foxholes into death traps and make American artillery the most feared weapon of the entire war. But the proximity fuse would get its first real test in the worst possible circumstances during the last desperate gamble of the Third Reich, a surprise attack that achieved complete tactical surprise and nearly split the Allied armies in two. Part 3. The Secret Weapon and the German Gamble. Before we get to the battle that proved everything, I need to tell you about the weapon that changed the mathematics of killing. For the entire history of artillery up to 1944, there was a fundamental problem. When a shell hit soft ground, mud, snow, plowed fields, it buried itself before exploding. Much of the lethal blast and shrapnel was absorbed by the earth. Soldiers in foxholes and trenches, the ones who were dug in properly, had reasonable protection. As long as a shell did not land directly in your hole, you had a decent chance of surviving. The ground was your friend. The proximity fuse erased that friendship. This was one of the most ambitious weapons programs of the war, second only to the Manhattan Project itself. American scientists, working under extreme secrecy with the British, had built a miniature radar transmitter small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. The fuse detected the ground as the shell descended and triggered detonation at the optimal height, roughly 20 to 50 feet above the surface. Instead of burying itself in the dirt, the shell exploded in the air and showered shrapnel downward onto troops below. Men who thought they were safe in their foxholes discovered that protection from ground-burst shells meant nothing when the shells were exploding above them. The effect was devastating. By conservative military estimates, proximity-fused shells were anywhere from 5 to 10 times more lethal against dug-in infantry than conventional rounds. Think about that math. If an American battery could normally suppress or kill a certain number of enemy soldiers with 100 rounds, with proximity fuses, that same 100 rounds could do the work of 500 to 1,000. The economics of killing had shifted radically in one direction. The program had produced over 22 million fuses by war's end, at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. The Americans kept it so secret that its use was initially restricted to naval engagements over open water, where unexploded shells would sink harmlessly rather than fall into enemy hands. When the decision was finally made to authorize proximity fuses for ground combat in December 1944, it was one of the most consequential decisions of the war, and the timing was not coincidental, because in December 1944, the Americans were about to need every advantage they could get. Now I need to explain something about why Germans feared Americans, but described the British in very different terms. This comparison matters, and it requires honest context that German officers themselves often left out of their post-war memoirs. German commanders consistently described the British with professional respect, but without that edge of anxiety that colored every discussion of American capabilities. The British were competent, methodical, predictable. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's operations followed recognizable patterns that German intelligence could anticipate. Massive logistical buildup, visible from the air for days. Overwhelming preliminary bombardment, providing hours of advance warning. Then infantry and armor advancing according to set-piece doctrine that had been refined but not fundamentally changed since North Africa. Von Rundstedt admitted in his post-war debriefing that his entire strategy in Normandy was to screen off the British with minimum forces while concentrating mobile reserves against the Americans. The fundamental reason was simple. He knew what the British would do before they did it. He was never certain what the Americans would do until they were already doing it. But fairness demands context. The British deliberately drew the heaviest German formations toward themselves in Normandy. That was Montgomery's operational plan. British and Canadian forces were specifically tasked with pinning down German armor around Caen, while the Americans prepared the breakout. 6 of the 7 panzer divisions committed to Normandy were concentrated against the British and Canadian sector. British caution was partly a rational response to facing the strongest opposition on ground that favored armored defense. Britain also had a manpower problem the Americans did not share. Having fought continuously for 2 years longer, with the mass trauma of Somme and Passchendaele still embedded in national memory, Britain simply could not sustain the same casualty rates as the larger American force. Conservative tactics that preserved manpower were strategic prudence, not timidity. What German officers genuinely feared about the Americans was not individual soldiers in personal combat. In small unit engagements, a German squad might outperform an American squad. What they feared was the system. The artillery that could mass hundreds of guns on a single target within minutes. The air power that made daylight movement suicidal. The logistics that kept ammunition, fuel, and replacements flowing in quantities that seemed literally impossible. And the adaptability. that sergeant with the hedgerow cutter, that fire direction center from Fort Sill, that willingness to fire a failed general after one battle and replace him with someone better, that culture of treating failure as a learning opportunity rather than a career-ending judgment. Speaking of American logistics, let me give you one number that explains why German commanders eventually felt a kind of despair when facing American forces. Battery C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion fired its 300,000th round between June 1944 and March 1945. A single battery, 300,000 shells. That output would have exhausted German ammunition stocks for an entire corps. For the 9th Army's crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, approximately 2,000 American guns opened fire at a rate exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute. Over 65,000 shells in a single bombardment lasting just over an hour. German artillery, forced to conserve every shell, using a logistically nightmarish mix of captured guns from France, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union that each required different ammunition, could not begin to match this output. General Hans Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, documented in his reports that his artillery included guns manufactured in half a dozen different countries, each requiring different ammunition calibers, different spare parts, different training for the crews. A shell made in one factory would not fit a gun made in another. The Americans standardized everything. A shell manufactured in Ohio fit a gun assembled in Michigan, being served by a crew trained in Oklahoma. The same industrial logic that Henry Ford used to revolutionize automobile production now built armies with identical efficiency. But all of these advantages, the artillery, the air power, the logistics, the adaptability, were about to face their ultimate test, because in December 1944, Adolf Hitler played his last card, and he played it well enough to terrify the entire Allied command structure. Hitler assembled the last strategic reserves of the German military, elite SS Panzer divisions, carefully rebuilt after their mauling in France, fresh Volksgrenadier divisions, the best remaining paratroopers. He pointed them at what intelligence indicated was the weakest sector of the Allied line, a thinly defended stretch of the Ardennes forest, where inexperienced American divisions had been sent to rest and recover. The offensive was premised partly on an assumption that American soldiers would crumble under determined surprise assault, just as they had at Kasserine nearly 2 years earlier. Hitler still believed the Americans were fundamentally soft. He was about to receive a brutal education. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it lifted, over 200,000 German soldiers surged forward through fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft and neutralized American air superiority. The initial assault shattered thinly held American positions. Shockwaves rippled through Allied command all the way back to Eisenhower's headquarters. The bulge was forming, and in the chaos of those first terrible hours, the story of what Americans had become since Kasserine would be written by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, starting with 18 of them on a frozen ridge near a village that nobody had ever heard of. Part 4. The Frozen Crucible. Battle of the Bulge. First Lieutenant Lyle Buck was 20 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. 20. He had joined the Missouri National Guard at age 14, to help his family pay the bills during hard times. He was so capable that after being sent to officer candidate school at Fort Benning, he graduated 4th in his class and was kept on as an instructor before finally being shipped to Europe with the 99th Infantry Division. On the morning of December 16, 1944, Buck and his 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon were dug into positions on a ridge overlooking the small Belgian village of Lanzerath. They had been there for 6 days, filling a gap in the line until the 106th Division could move into position. They were not a combat unit. Their job was reconnaissance, sneaking behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, capturing German soldiers for interrogation. They were expert marksmen, selected for peak physical condition, some of them college-educated former members of the Army Specialized Training Program. But they were not trained to hold a defensive position against a major assault. Buck had taken his assignment seriously anyway. He ordered his men to dig deep, reinforce foxholes with pine logs, and set up camouflaged firing positions with interlocking fields of fire. He had a .30 caliber machine gun, 2 Browning automatic rifles, and, in a stroke of resourcefulness that would prove critical, he had traded a supply sergeant for the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on his jeep. Then he waited. At 5:30 that morning, the sky exploded. The German artillery barrage was terrifying, but, as Buck would later recall, not devastating. Most rounds landed long, short, or wide of his positions, and his well-built foxholes protected his men. But the telephone lines were cut. His radio barely functioned, and when he managed to get through to regimental headquarters and reported what was happening, the reply was chilling. "Hold your position at all costs." Buck looked down the slope toward Lanzerath. What he saw should have made any reasonable officer consider immediate retreat. Hundreds of German soldiers, paratroopers of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, the spearhead infantry that was supposed to clear the route for Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division, were streaming toward his position. According to various accounts, approximately 500 German paratroopers against 18 Americans, plus 4 forward artillery observers from Battery C of the 371st Field Artillery Battalion, 22 Americans in total. But here is the detail that captures Buck's character, and the character of the American soldier in December 1944. He had sent one of his men, Vernon Leopold, back to regiment before the attack. Leopold was a German-born Jew. Buck knew that if Leopold was captured, the SS would kill him. Years later, Leopold would say that Buck saved his life. The first German assault came in the early afternoon. The paratroopers, once an elite formation but badly depleted after Normandy, and now filled with replacements, marched down the road toward Lanzerath with an arrogance that came from not knowing what they were walking into. Buck ordered his men to hold fire. "Let the lead elements pass. Wait for officers. Wait until you can count the buttons on their uniforms." Then they opened fire. Every man's rifle found its mark. The .50 caliber tore through the column. Germans dove for ditches on either side of the road. The paratroopers, not realizing they were facing fewer than 24 men, sent a full company, over 150 soldiers, charging up the hill. They were cut down in the open field. A second assault. Cut down again. The Germans paused, regrouped, sent a third wave. Each time, Buck's men held their ground, shifting positions, conserving ammunition, fighting with a desperation born of knowing that there was literally nowhere to retreat to. The artillery observers tried to call in fire support. None came. The phone lines were dead, and the radio was barely working. For hour after hour, through the short winter day, 22 Americans held off 500 Germans. They killed or wounded 92 of the attackers. Only 1 American was killed, a forward artillery observer. 14 were wounded. As darkness fell, the Germans finally flanked the position through the woods. The Americans were overrun, 1 foxhole at a time. Out of ammunition, most of them wounded, they were captured at gunpoint. Buck thought he was about to be shot when a German soldier put a machine gun in his back and pulled the trigger, but the weapon was empty. Instead, they were marched into captivity. And here is where the story takes a turn that Buck himself would not understand for decades. He considered the battle a failure. His men had been captured, his position had been lost. He spent the rest of the war in freezing, disease-ridden prisoner camps, nearly dying of hepatitis and malnutrition. What Buck did not know was what his 18 men had accomplished. The delay at Lanzerath Ridge had bottled up the entire timetable for Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division. Peiper's lead units, which were supposed to reach the Meuse River on the first day of the offensive, did not even get through Lanzerath until hours behind schedule. The advance that German planners expected to cover in 9 hours, the same distance their panzers had crossed in 1940, took 36 frustrating hours just to reach the town of Stavelot. Every hour of delay cost the Germans irreplaceable fuel and time. American engineers demolished bridges in Peiper's path, soldiers emptied fuel depots, and set them ablaze rather than let gasoline fall into German hands. The clock that was supposed to be ticking in Germany's favor was now ticking against them. But Lanzerath was just one small piece of a much larger picture, because the real crushing blow to the German offensive happened a few miles to the north, on a frozen piece of high ground that most Americans have never heard of, Elsenborn Ridge. This is where American artillery, that system developed at Fort Sill, perfected in North Africa, refined in Normandy, delivered its most devastating performance of the entire war. And this is where the proximity fuse got its battlefield debut in ground combat. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 1st and 9th Divisions, established defensive positions on and around Elsenborn Ridge. The ridge controlled the road network that the German 6th SS Panzer Army needed to reach the Meuse, and beyond it, the port of Antwerp, the strategic prize of the entire offensive. If the Germans could not take Elsenborn, the northern prong of the Bulge was dead. Hitler committed his best units. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, composed of fanatical young soldiers indoctrinated since childhood, was given the task of breaking through. They attacked with the suicidal intensity that had characterized the Waffen-SS throughout the war. They ran straight into an artillery concentration that survivors would describe in terms approaching religious horror. American artillery batteries, registered on every approach, every road, every logical assembly area, rained fire on the advancing Germans with a density that defied comprehension. The fire direction centers coordinated guns from multiple divisions, massing fire with a speed that the German system could not match. And now, for the first time in a major ground engagement, those shells were equipped with proximity fuses. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had endured Soviet artillery barrages that were legendary for their volume, reported that American artillery at Elsenborn was the most terrifying thing they had ever experienced. It was not just the volume, it was the accuracy. It was the airburst shells that exploded above them, turning their foxholes into death traps. There was, literally, nowhere to hide. The 12th SS Panzer Division threw itself against the American positions again and again. Attack after attack was shattered by massed artillery and determined infantry. American Graves registration teams later counted 782 German dead in front of just the 26th Infantry Regiment's positions alone. The burnt hulks of 47 German tanks lay scattered across the landscape, some still burning days after the fighting. The dead SS soldiers, many as young as 15 and 16 years old, were described by American patrols as being as common as grass. Here is a detail that captures the difference between the two sides at Elsenborn. When the 99th Division, remember, these were inexperienced troops who had been in Europe for barely 6 weeks, began running low on ammunition during one of the German assaults, a resourceful platoon leader discovered an abandoned German ammunition dump nearby. His unit fought off the tail end of a German attack, using captured German guns and German ammunition. That is not something you read about in doctrine manuals. That is improvisation under fire. That is the American way of war that German commanders could not predict and could not plan against. The soft ground in front of Elsenborn Ridge became a graveyard for German armor. One Sturmgeschütz assault gun after another bogged down in the mud, unable to advance, unable to retreat, sitting ducks for American artillery that had every square meter of the approaches pre-registered. The 3rd Panzergrenadier Division alone lost 15 tanks in a single day to American guns they never even saw. By December 27th, it was over. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army had beaten itself into a state of uselessness against the American positions. The 12th SS Panzer, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier, and all their supporting Volksgrenadier divisions had been fought to exhaustion. Elsenborn Ridge was the only sector of the American front during the entire Battle of the Bulge where the Germans failed to advance even a single mile. Not one. General George Patton, who was not at Elsenborn but was eagerly tracking the performance of proximity-fused shells elsewhere during the Bulge, wrote to the War Department about the new weapon. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. 702 men from a single artillery strike, with shells that could not be hidden from, because they exploded above you no matter how deep your hole. German prisoners captured during the Bulge reported something that American intelligence officers found both remarkable and horrifying. Some German soldiers had charged directly into American positions rather than endure the airburst artillery. They preferred the chance of being shot in a direct assault to the certainty of being shredded by fragments raining down from above. Think about the level of fear required to make a man run towards the guns because it felt safer than staying in his foxhole. While Elsenborn held the northern shoulder of the Bulge, another drama was unfolding at the town that would become the most famous name of the battle, Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, along with Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and remnants of other shattered units, found themselves surrounded by overwhelming German forces. The Panzer-Lehr Division, rebuilt since its annihilation at Cobra, though still a shadow of its former self, was among the units pressing the siege. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American perimeter under a flag of truce and delivered a formal ultimatum demanding surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The message was brought to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, temporarily commanding the 101st. McAuliffe's response has become the stuff of legend, a single word that every American schoolchild used to know: nuts. The German officers who received this reply were genuinely confused. They asked if it was affirmative or negative. The American colonel who delivered McAuliffe's answer clarified, "It means, go to hell." The defenders held their shrinking perimeter through days of bitter fighting in freezing conditions, supplied only by airdrops when the weather briefly cleared. And then George Patton performed what military historians still consider one of the greatest logistical and tactical feats of the entire war. He pivoted his entire Third Army, over 100,000 men, 90 degrees northward, in the middle of winter, over roads clogged with ice and retreating traffic. He advanced over 100 miles in less than a week and broke through to relieve Bastogne on December 26th. To appreciate how remarkable this was, consider that Patton had been attacking in a completely different direction when the Bulge began. His staff had already prepared contingency plans for exactly this kind of pivot, because Patton always planned for contingencies, but the execution required moving an army the size of a small nation's entire military force, changing its direction of advance by 90 degrees, and attacking through enemy resistance, all while keeping the supply lines intact. No other army in the world could have done it that fast. The German army certainly could not have, and the British, with their methodical approach, would not have attempted it. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons in January 1945 and spoke of the battle with unusual generosity toward the American ally. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, Churchill declared, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last strategic reserves of men and equipment. The SS Panzer divisions that had been so carefully rebuilt were shattered beyond repair. The fuel and ammunition that could never be replaced had been burned through in 6 weeks of fighting that achieved nothing. The 6th Panzer Army, which had been Hitler's pride, was transferred to the Eastern Front in January 1945, beaten, broken, and useless for the purpose it had been created to serve. The verdict was written in blood and frozen earth. The Americans had not crumbled. They had not panicked. When surprise achieved its maximum effect, when weather negated air superiority, when experienced German formations struck with everything they had, the Americans held. And then they counterattacked. And then they won. But the full story of what this meant, what it felt like from the German side, what the officers who survived wrote about in their memoirs, and what happened to the men who made it possible, requires one final chapter, and it requires us to return to where we started, to a young German soldier lying face down in frozen Belgian mud, wondering how an army that could barely find Tunisia on a map 2 years earlier had become the thing he feared most in the world. Part 5 plus verdict: the fear and the legacy. By the spring of 1945, American forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points. German cities burned under bombing that no longer faced meaningful opposition. The factories that had produced the Wehrmacht's weapons lay in ruins. The strategic reserves of men and equipment were completely exhausted. The fuel that any modern army requires for operation was gone beyond recovery. German soldiers fought on with characteristic stubborn courage, but they fought without hope, and the memoirs they left behind, the interrogation transcripts, the letters, the post-war interviews, paint a portrait of men who had encountered something in the American military that they did not fully understand and could not effectively counter. Let me share a few of their words, not to gloat. There is nothing to celebrate in mass killing, but because the German perspective is the most honest measure of what the American army had become. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, the man whose Panzer Lehr division was destroyed at Cobra, wrote that no previous campaign in history could approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in the magnitude of planning, the logic of execution, the seamless collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces, or the bulk of prisoners taken. Remember, this was a professional German officer trained to analyze military operations objectively. He was not trying to flatter his captors. He was trying to explain what had happened to his elite division. Günther Blumentritt, whose quote about Patton opened this story, went further in his analysis. He described the American system as something that went beyond individual military skill. It was, he suggested, a product of the entire American society, the industrial capacity, the organizational flexibility, the cultural willingness to solve problems from any level of the hierarchy. But perhaps the most revealing assessment came not from a general, but from common German soldiers. Interrogation records from 1944 and 1945 show a consistent pattern. When asked what weapon they feared most, German soldiers overwhelmingly cited American artillery. Not tanks, not planes, artillery, the guns they could not see, firing shells they could not dodge, controlled by a system they could not disrupt. When asked to compare American and British forces, the answers were equally consistent. The British were professional and cautious. You could predict their attacks and prepare accordingly. The Americans were unpredictable. They attacked when you did not expect it, from directions that did not make doctrinal sense, with a weight of fire that seemed physically impossible for the number of troops engaged. They made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, but they corrected those mistakes with a speed that no German model could account for. One German battalion commander captured in Normandy told his interrogators, "I have been fighting the Russians for 3 years. I would rather fight them for another 3 years than face the Americans for 3 more months." Let me take you back to Werner Stretchik, the young German paratrooper from our opening. He survived the bulge. He was captured in early 1945. In a prisoner of war camp in France, he was interviewed by American intelligence officers who asked him to describe his combat experience. His account, one of thousands collected in the post-war years, captures the essence of what German soldiers felt. He described the airburst artillery as the worst experience of the war, worse than anything on the Eastern Front, where he had also served briefly. He described American infantry advancing behind a wall of fire so dense that it seemed like the earth itself was being peeled away. He described the constant presence of American aircraft that made any movement during daylight impossible, and he described something else, a psychological effect that went beyond physical danger. The feeling of being overwhelmed not by a single threat, but by a system of interlocking capabilities that left no weakness to exploit. When one weapon stopped, he said, another started. When one unit was exhausted, fresh troops appeared. It was like fighting water. You could push it aside in one place, but it flowed back from every other direction. Fighting water. That is what the American military had become by 1945. Now let me close the circle. Lyle Buch, the 20-year-old lieutenant who held Lanzerath Ridge with 18 men, survived the prisoner camps. He came home to St. Louis, emaciated and suffering from hepatitis, and for decades considered the battle a failure. He became a chiropractor, married his grade school classmate Lucy, raised 3 children. He did not talk much about the war. It was not until 1965, when the Army published its official history of the Bulge, and his platoon was mentioned in passing, that the process of recognition began. His former platoon member, William Tsakanikas, who had legally changed his name to William James after the war, contacted Buck and urged him to fight for his men's recognition. Buck spent years writing letters, lobbying, pushing, not for himself. He refused to be the star of the story. He wanted every man in his platoon recognized. On October 26, 1981, 37 years after the battle, every member of the platoon was finally decorated. 4 received the Distinguished Service Cross, 5 received the Silver Star, 9 received the Bronze Star with Valor Device. They were officially recognized as the most decorated American platoon for a single action in all of World War II. Buck's Aunt Mildred had once read his palm before he shipped overseas. "If you live past your 21st birthday," she had told him, "you're going to have a good life." He turned 21 on December 17, 1944, the day after the battle, the day after he was captured. He was right on the edge. She was right. He lived to be 92, passing away in December 2016, 72 years after the battle that defined his life. He never stopped fighting for his men. He never stopped making sure they were remembered. That is the story of why German soldiers feared American infantry. Not because individual Americans were superhuman. They were not. They were farm boys and factory workers and college students and kids from Jersey who joined the Guard at 14. They made terrible mistakes. They lost badly at first. Their equipment was not always the best. Their tanks were outgunned by Tigers and Panthers. Their individual training often lagged behind their German counterparts. But they built something that multiplied every rifleman, every tank crew, every artillery battery far beyond what individual performance would predict. They built an integrated system for waging modern war that learned from failure faster than anyone believed possible. They created a military culture where a sergeant's idea could reshape a battlefield, where a failed general could be replaced overnight, where a 20-year-old lieutenant could hold a ridge against 500 men because the system had given him the training, the weapons, and the will to try. The Germans who faced them at Kasserine were right that February. Those Americans could not fight, but they were catastrophically wrong about what those same Americans could become. The improvement came faster than any German model predicted. The learning curve was steeper than any enemy had ever demonstrated, and by the time the Wehrmacht understood what was happening, it was too late to stop it. The factories that built the weapons have mostly been closed or converted to other purposes. The soldiers who carried those weapons are nearly all gone now. The generation that fought the war grows smaller each year. The conflict they waged ended 8 decades ago. But the evidence of what happened survives in archives and memoirs and interrogation transcripts for anyone willing to look. The German officers who faced American forces left detailed assessments because their captors asked them to explain what they had experienced and why they had lost. They answered honestly for the most part, because the war was over and the truth no longer had tactical consequences. There is one more thing worth knowing about these post-war German assessments. Some historians have pointed out, correctly, that the admiring tone of German officers toward American commanders, particularly Patton, may have been partly strategic. These men were prisoners. They had every incentive to flatter their captors, to tell them what they wanted to hear. The Germans may have played up their fear of Americans while downplaying their respect for the Soviets, who were now the West's Cold War adversary. That is a fair criticism, and it should be acknowledged. But the sheer volume and consistency of these accounts, from generals to privates, from formal interrogations to casual conversations, from memoirs written in captivity to books published decades later, suggests that whatever degree of flattery existed, the underlying assessment was genuine. They really were afraid of American artillery. They really were overwhelmed by American logistics. They really were stunned by the speed of American adaptation. You can exaggerate genuine fear, but you cannot invent it from nothing across thousands of independent testimonies. And what they described, again and again, was not admiration for individual American soldiers, though some earned that admiration 100 times over. What they described was fear of the system, fear of the artillery that appeared from nowhere, fear of the logistics that never stopped, fear of the air power that owned the sky, fear of the adaptability that turned yesterday's mistakes into tomorrow's solutions, fear of an army that, unlike any other they had fought, got dramatically better every single time it was knocked down. The Americans they met at Kasserine were not the Americans who shattered the Wehrmacht in Normandy and the Bulge. The army that fled in February 1943 became the army that no German force could stop by the summer of 1944. That transformation is one of the most remarkable stories in all of military history, and it happened because ordinary people, a sergeant from New Jersey, a lieutenant from Missouri, a general from California with ivory-handled pistols, and millions of men whose names no one remembers, rose to meet an extraordinary challenge when their moment of testing arrived. They were not supermen. They were simply people who refused to accept that their worst day defined them, and in doing so, they gave the most feared army on earth a reason to be genuinely afraid. If you found this story worth your time, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep history deserves to reach more people. And subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. Because the Second World War has more stories like this than any lifetime could tell, and every one of them deserves to be remembered. I will see you in the comments. And remember, history is not just about what happened. It is about what it tells us about what people are capable of becoming.